Welcome to the second video on P.D. James's 1972 novel, An Unsuitable Job for a Woman. Another video in the series Greenwich Detective Fiction created for the third-year core course in English Literature at the University of Greenwich. This one begins our discussion of gender. In the first video on An Unsuitable Job, I said we'd return to a curious phrase from what seems just a postscript to the novel, where Adam Dalgliesh seems to take over the case and wrest its interpretation away from Cordelia. Adam Dalgliesh becomes the detective. And that phrase is Pryde took his revenge. And that's indeed what we'll be doing. We'll be thinking through the implications of that phrase. But in order to do so, we need first to establish a few things. First, what genre is the novel? In the first video on An Unsuitable Job for a Woman, I was careful to show its similarities and differences from Golden Age detective fiction, and to suggest that placing it in that tradition was part of its author's brand promise. A brand promise that limits or at least suggests some kind of expected or dominant reading of a text. It's a process that operates right across literature, and education is in many respects a training in brand awareness and literary brand awareness. Our qualification in English literature trains us to know what we're getting when we see the name of Wordsworth, say, or Raymond Chandler or P.D. James. And almost always that brand promise is tied to class, certainly to a market segment of a population, where class, along with gender, ethnicity, geography, and other factors, are all important. And in P.D. James's case, that brand image is connected to, or has been connected to in the past, to conservative middle class. But that's not only how An Unsuitable Job for a Woman has been seen. By academics, it's also been seen as a novel of the formation of character, a Bildungsroman of a young woman growing up. And that Bildung has specific class implications, of course, but also, again, as I promised you, gender implications. I'm thinking of the novel as belonging to a tradition of the Bildungsroman, which is a very venerable one, suggests that we start with a focus on the family, and particularly on patriarchal family relations with fathers or father figures. And then tied into that set of relations, and again tied into the tradition of the Bildungsroman, is the question asked by the title of the novel. How far is detective work suitable for a woman? What's the suitability of the job for its central character? Are they asking who gets to decide on the suitability of any kind of employment for a woman? And that will take us to the practice of what's called the homosocial. And then, and only then, will we be able to address the question of what Pryde took his revenge really means. So that's our research question for this video. What does Pryde took his revenge actually mean?
So first we need to establish what kind of novel An Unsuitable Job for a Woman is. I've said several times in this series of videos now that form seeks to limit our interpretative possibilities. It tries to help us understand the text by that limitation. It creates a hierarchy and thereby seeks to help us decide what's important and what's not in the pretty nigh infinite possibilities of meaning that a novel can give us. What form we choose to see, and of course we have to be able to recognize the form by connecting it to previous examples. We need to reference our archives, which is why you see archive on the screen there. What form we see, what category or genre we place a text in, will largely determine what we come to see as important about it. So, seeing An Unsuitable Job for a Woman as a Bildungsroman has certain implications. So let's remind ourselves what a Bildungsroman actually is. Well, it's sometimes described as a coming-of-age novel, a novel about how a central character comes to be who they are at a point close to the telling of the story. Or indeed, in some cases, like David Copperfield, a novel about how the narration of the story itself comes about and how the narrator came into being. The Bildungsroman, how it's conceived today, is fundamentally a romantic period conception. You can see on the screen that you'll find the protagonist is the prototype, of the Bildungsroman is commonly regarded as a novel by the German author Goethe, dating from the 1790s. The Bildungsroman is an exploration, so we're usually told, of the formation, the establishment in the face of difficulties of middle-class identity. And you'll see from just these two examples that we're talking mainly about middle-class male identity. The central character at the end of a Bildungsroman gains a recognized place in society, is recognized by society, is integrated into society. The Bildungsroman typically charts how a character finds himself, which means basically that it charts a journey from outside or on the margins of society to within it. Now, as we saw last week, Cordelia flirts with, plays with, is almost seduced into moving inside society. Remember, Hugo tries to pick her up at the end. That's one future possibility for her, which she doesn't want. She resists integration. She prefers to remain on the edge, on the margins, not outside, but on the margins. The very last words suggest Cordelia moving into her office. "Won't you come in?" are the novel's last words, leaving us to guess what happens next and only indicating through suggesting rather that she's actually moving into her office. As we saw in the last video, she's taking on a seedy and not noble case, a case where she has to spy on a woman at the service of a man. Is, at this stage, Cordelia really integrated into patriarchal society at the end? If you want to regard this novel as in a tradition of male-centered novels of formation, then perhaps yes, perhaps you'll think that she's learned her place. She's not on the side of women, but of men. She's been tamed, domesticated, integrated into patriarchy. And that is a conventional view of the novel by many critics. I don't know about you though, I rebel. I imagine a different story in the white space that tells me the novel's over. But I'm running ahead of myself. Or am I dropping a red herring? A typical Bildungsroman is keen to show what effects various family members have on the central character, what they contribute to his Bildung, to his formation. Now, the idea of the simple biological nuclear family of two parents and children is very often questioned in the Bildungsroman. We're talking about parent substitutes rather than biological parents. We see that very powerfully in David Copperfield, as you recall. What's not questioned in the Bildungsroman is the ideal that family members have an obligation to one another. Ideally, the parents or parent substitutes should nurture their children to enable their Bildung, their positive formation of a character. What happens in An Unsuitable Job for a Woman? Let's think about mothers first. Well, it's quite complicated in Cordelia's and Mark's case. In Cordelia's case, her biological mother dies long before Cordelia can know her, after a few hours. In Mark's case, Evelyn Callender dies after 9 months. We never even find out Cordelia's mother's name. Now, Miss Leeming is, of course, Mark's biological mother, but she can't acknowledge that even while she is working in the same house as him or is around him a lot and then comes to live in the same house. Instead, at least for a short time, Mark has a substitute mother in Nanny Pilbeam, who, while very affectionate, is separated from him by class. And so Ronald makes sure that she doesn't hang around after Evelyn Callender dies when Mark's 9 months old. And instead, he gets in professionally trained nannies before he sends Mark off to school as early as possible. Now, in the 19th century Bildungsroman tradition, non-biological parents are quite common. As I said, men can perform the roles of mothers as well as fathers, for example. But these substitutes don't seem to have done Mark much good. Cordelia, meanwhile, is passed around what the narrator repeatedly calls a succession of foster mothers, only one of whom is named Mrs. Wilkes, the woman who lived her life by comfortable maxims stored like nuggets of coal against the winter. But unlike Mark, Cordelia encounters a host of alternative and positive mothers, from the woman in Somerset House in the Strand, where Cordelia goes to consult the will of Mark's grandfather, and indeed Miss Feakins, who runs the secretarial agency through which Cordelia's got her secretarial jobs before she defected to detection. The narrator, ventriloquizing Cordelia's thoughts, compares Miss Feakins wryly to a brothel madam recommending her latest recruit to one of her fussier customers. Most superior girl, well educated, who like her, and a worker. But the most important maternal figures for Cordelia are, of course, the nuns in Cordelia's school, the Catholic convent where her father leaves her. And this women's philanthropy, this women's nurturing space, Cordelia learns the skills to survive. She gains her cultural capital there, capital which includes her accent to her knowledge of literature. She also gains her academic ambition. While Cordelia's terrible history has been adumbrated previously, it's in this passage in chapter 2 that I think we see it for the first time very clearly. It's worth reading closely. You remember from the first video how close the past is to the present for Cordelia. Here she has a moment of reflection of the kind Marlowe has in his structured moments of repose. Cordelia is sitting by the great stone wall which runs from the chapel, King's College Chapel, down to the river bank outside King's College in Cambridge. She's eating her lunch in the sun. It's a beautiful scene that should bring pleasure. Instead, it conjures a train of memories of frustrated hopes and ambition crushed. Daddy does not come out of this passage well, as the highlighted words suggest. First, he calls Cordelia a fascist and the Catholic nuns by the derogatory name papists. Now, I'm not going to say more about that. Daddy is just awful. We know from Cordelia's conversation with Miss Fromsett on the train to Cambridge that her father had been an itinerant Marxist poet and amateur revolutionary, and it's now that we find out more about him. He may be a political idealist, but he doesn't have feelings for his child. He doesn't know how to be a father and aid his child's Bildung. In Cordelia's memory, she tries to placate him. It's not her fault that she's not his double. It's not her fault that she's different from him. She ascribes their difference here to chance. Yet Cordelia knows otherwise. It's father's fault that she stayed on the convent because her father hadn't bothered to get her out when he could have. While the Reverend Mother had tried to conceal her father's indifference from Cordelia, that tried is important as it indicates the Reverend Mother's lack of success. Cordelia understands all too well. But she's resilient. She turns her father's indifference to her advantage. She thrives in this all-women space amongst clever women. She learns for the first time that she doesn't need to hide the clever girl she is. The nuns, these non-biological mothers, sustain her. They bring her up and bring her out. They help her achieve her formation. They help her Bildung. They don't try to crush her. They even allow her to remain Protestant. For look again. Cordelia, though, is on the margins as a Protestant, even while she remains a member of the Catholic school where she's very happy, where she responds to order and no doubt internalizes that delight in order. Cordelia is not just allowed to emerge as clever, she has windows opened to her as a possible future. And the sisters are indeed progressive, for even if women were first admitted to Girton College in Cambridge in 1869, it wasn't until 1948 that they were awarded degrees, just 2 years before we might imagine Cordelia being born. For if she wasn't born in 1950, she was born around that time. Cordelia's 15, we're told, when Sister Perpetua is telling her what you see on the screen. That's just 17 years after women were awarded degrees in Cambridge. It must be around 1965 when Lucy Cavendish College was founded by women academics at the university who believed that the university offered too few and too restricted opportunities for women as either students or academics. And that's only the 4th college for women. Women were first admitted into male colleges only in 1972, the year that An Unsuitable Job for a Woman was published. So then you see that Cordelia, in her memory, is presenting herself and to us as really exceptionally clever, a member of a very small elite band of women, a band comprising a few hundreds, not thousands of women. But at the same time, Sister Perpetua is setting up women as self-sacrificing. She's modelling renunciation for Cordelia, a typical move that curiously, perversely even, that self, by praising what one has to give up, undermines the self. It's a safe position to be in. One cannot fail in what one has never properly tried. One cannot fail in the, oh, if only I had stayed on. Here again, then, is an example of that psychological realism that connects P.D. James to the Golden Age. But it's a very different psychological realism to that period. It's a more perverse one, in some ways a pitiless version of psychology. It's a manifestation of the much publicized, penetrating gaze that was, until recently at least, core to the P.D. James brand. Perhaps mothers, even the fantasy good ones, like here, have their limits. As for fathers, well, in many ways they're simpler than the mothers. They're all emotionally deficient. They all treat their children as objects. They are, in the terms of the Bildungsroman, failed fathers, in that they do not forward in a positive way their children's characters and, crucially, their independence from them. Sir Ronald is only the most spectacular of the failures, and that he murders his own son. But even before that, as Miss Leeming says, Ronald never cared for his son. He found that he couldn't love him. Now, Sir Ronald's father-in-law, Mr. Botley, the wool trader who worked in Bradford with a smart house in the smart spa town of Harrogate, Mr. Botley did adore Mark. And he's not really a positive nurturing type either. He's only interested in an heir. He regards his daughter Evelyn as a mere bridge between himself and that male heir. Evelyn is not of much interest in herself. As Nanny Pilbeam tells Cordelia, Mrs. Calendar used to dread his visits, poor darling. He was looking for a grandchild, you see, and one didn't come. He leaves half his fortune to his daughter because she's been successful in producing a male heir, and, of course, that passed to Sir Ronald. And Mr. Botley left the rest to Mark. It's that Sir Ronald wants. Cordelia's father, as we already know, is pretty grim. But what about the substitute father, Bernie? How effective is he? It is, after all, he who inducts Cordelia into detection. It's he who gives her an identity as a private detective. But though she has affection for him and he for her, he's ultimately a failure too, for he abandons her just as much as her biological father did. He could have prepared Cordelia for his death, but chose not to. We can imagine that he wouldn't have wanted to risk a scene where she tries to persuade him to face cancer treatment and be strong. Bernie, even though he's conferred on her employment identity, is ultimately weak. He's a failure too. The fathers of some of the Cambridge set are mentioned in passing. How do they figure? Well, Isabel's father pays for what we and Cordelia imagine must be a hefty rent for a smart house in an expensive street in Cambridge. Here's the kind of thing that Isabel's father rents for her. He's just given her, of course, a small Renoir to decorate her Panton Street house. He's evidently very wealthy and wants to ensure that his child is decorated appropriately to display his wealth. Hugo makes a good deal of how much money Isabel has, and that's probably one of her several attractions for him. But Isabel's father is a tyrant. Hugo tells Cordelia towards the end of the novel that Isabel's had to go home to Lyon. Papa turned up unexpectedly yesterday and found that Mademoiselle wasn't exactly earning her wages. Papa decided that dear Isabel was getting less, or it may have been more, out of her Cambridge education than he'd expected. Papa has taken Isabel off into his possession because she's, and the key term here is of course implied by the mention of her wages, Isabel is not doing her job. As for Hugo and Sophia's father, whom we also hear about at the end, this time from Dalgliesh, he's evidently a psychiatrist, evidently a famous one, as Dalgliesh expects the assistant commissioner to know who he is. He's a psychiatrist who feels he has sufficient authority to call the police, outraged because his son and daughter have been questioned about Mark Calendar's death. At this stage in the game, we would rather suspect that he too is treating his children as possessions that need protecting rather than as individuals who need nurturing. He too seems pretty much like a failure. In short, parents of both sexes fail, but in different ways, in aiding the Bildung formation of young people and their integration into society as independent individuals. Parents tend to block development. They pervert it, offer bad values by being overly protective, or at best, in the case of Sister Perpetua, nurture development so that hopes are raised that are based on disappointment and self-sacrifice. Hopes that therefore prefigure self-sacrifice and disappointment rather than fulfillment. Cordelia and Mark are marginal, and while Isabel, Sophia and Hugo are very much within society, they're not independent actors within it. Their independence is crushed by powerful fathers. These characters aren't really being prepared for the world of professional work, where independent judgment and a sense of disembodied impartiality are fundamental values, at least in theory. And this mention of work and a development of formation that leads towards work brings us to the next major question, whether the novel shows that detection really is a suitable job for a woman. The title itself is a very curious one for a detective or crime story. It's worth putting a question mark behind it. Are we supposed to regard it as a statement or a question? Now, I think it's worth thinking about, as there are various options for titles for detective or crime fiction novels, and I wonder which category this title falls into. Well, the most obvious one is a title that refers to some aspect of the crime or the crime itself. We think of The Murders in the Rue Morgue, A Scandal in Bohemia, or even Matched, if you think that the criminal both matches herself with a series of husbands and with the detective herself. The match, the game, is itself the crime. Perhaps, like any number of novels in general, a detective story might be named after a central character whose identity the text investigates. Henry Dunbar, The Wicked Boy, The Lady in the Lake, perhaps Stieg Larsson's The Girl with the Dragon Tattoo, or the 1990s Devil in a Blue Dress by Walter Mosley. Perhaps the title of the detective story will highlight some evidence, some clue that turns out to be key to the unravelling of the knotted mystery. The Red Silk Scarf, Wilkie Collins's The Moonstone, Dashiell Hammett's The Maltese Falcon. Another possibility for a title may be literary, maybe a literary folk or slang reference. Agatha Christie's And Then There Were None, or The Mirror Cracked, a quotation from Tennyson's poem The Lady of Shalott, or Raymond Chandler's The Big Sleep, a euphemism for death, or then Umberto Eco's hugely influential 1980 bestseller, The Name of the Rose, which is both a literary quotation from the writing of a 12th century monk Bernard of Cluny and a reflection on one of the central questions the novel addresses. How does language operate, and how does language get translated into real life? Rather horribly, I can tell you. If you haven't read it, it's certainly worth a read. Now, this kind seems to focus our attention on the game of meaning, the game of detection that such texts openly play with us. They highlight the intertextual nature of how texts mean, not what they mean, but how they mean. As an unsuitable job seems to refer, though, to a social situation or a set of beliefs and practices, whether certain jobs are appropriate for women. Perhaps discourses of gender is the mystery that the novel explores. Now, I'm taking it as a subset of the kind of title that emphasizes the investigation of language, since of course beliefs can only operate through language. Discourse is key. Discourse, you remember, is the set of unspoken rules, or in this case, spoken rules, that determine reality. Is the reality that detection is a suitable job for a woman? Is that true or not? But does that mean then that the mystery or crime of the novel is not so much the murder of Mark, but whether the job of detection is what's being investigated? Well, the question is explicitly explored at various points in the novel. The first time the title of the novel debated is in the conversation between Cordelia and the barmaid Mavis of the Golden Pheasant, when she goes there after Bernie's body's been taken away. It's not the first time we see Cordelia facing sexism, of course. It's when the young policeman arrives, he simply assumes that Cordelia was Bernie's secretary, and she immediately puts him straight and rather overcompensates by claiming authority for herself through Bernie and through Bernie to Adam Dalgliesh. Well, that's not what she says she thinks or what the narrator says she's thinking. She thinks she's defending Bernie by giving him a glamorous work history, and of course she is, but in declaring Bernie's work genealogy, she's also, of course, attributing it to herself. Now, she immediately regrets it. She sees that the young policeman doesn't recognize what her sign of symbolic capital expressed through social capital, the network of contacts that lies behind the agency. But it does reveal to us that there is this connection. This and the 7 other times that Dalgliesh is explicitly named in his absence prepare the way for his appearance at the end. We are getting there, you see. Here, though, we see Cordelia trying to fight sexist assumption and trying to claim status for herself through claiming what she thinks is a high status social network for herself. Now, this isn't the only way she tries to combat sexism, as we see in the conversation with Mavis. In the conversation between Cordelia and Mavis at the Golden Pheasant that you can see here, Cordelia has just told Mavis and her regulars about Bernie's suicide and his cancer, and she said it in such a clinical manner that they're shocked. She thinks they're shocked only by the mention of cancer, but surely it's her coldness that shocks. It's not just what she's describing, but how. Of course, here in the passage on the screen, it's significant that it's a woman who tries to regulate another woman's behaviour. That it's significant that a woman should be an agent of patriarchal patterns of exclusion. Just as P.T. James is a woman doesn't mean to say that P.T. James can't be sexist. Cordelia rebels by levelling her job with that of Mavis initially. Both are jobs, she says, that have to deal with all kinds of people. Mavis refuses defeat, and so does Cordelia, and it's rather like that antagonistic encounter between Philip Marlowe and Derace Kingsley at the opening of The Lady in the Lake. In both cases, in The Lady in the Lake and in An Unsuitable Job, the detective wins the verbal sparring match. But Cordelia is confronted by the price of her victory. Rather than being able to dominate the verbal space, invade it and take it over and get what she wants, she's left on the margins of it by her realization that her bravado and seeming callousness in the face of the death of her mother, as well as of Bernie just previously, has shocked the people in the bar, even while she knows that in other cases they take on board opinions that shock her and that she thinks should shock them. She silenced Mavis's attempt to police her, not with claims of social capital this time, but with the bare facts of her own history. She's won the battle, indeed, but unlike in the Chandler, it looks like she's lost the war. And we're only a few pages into the story. What do we feel about that? What's going to come next? Is it going to end well? In the next passage, which comes very shortly after, or really almost immediately after the previous one, Cordelia goes and sits down with her lunch in the Golden Pheasant. And here we learn of a key aspect of Cordelia's resistance. We learn what her survival mechanism is. In the face of the violence she's endured, the violence and neglect she's endured, in the mess and muddle of the world outside the convent, Cordelia's had to create a fantasy of a good mother, a fantasy of a nurturing, supportive mother who affirms her against the gender police Mavis. The mother that says, in fantasy, yes, being a detective is an entirely suitable job for a woman. Cordelia's fantasy of her mother is a necessary fantasy for her, but it's a fantasy nonetheless. Women's claims to equality in the workplace, so far at least in this text, seem to be based on a lie. Is this another example of P.D. James's adherence to a conservative Anglicanism that at the time forbade women priests? The next time the phrase appears is when Cordelia has gone to the bathroom at Sophie's house. She overhears a conversation between Isabel, Sophie, and Hugo about her. While Isabel assumes, like her father, that everything can be bought, Hugo and Sophie place Cordelia in the tradition of the honourable detective, rather like the chivalrous, socially responsible Marlowe. Again, it's a member of the female gender police who utters the phrase, "It's not a suitable job for a woman." This icon of completely conventional femininity. But what are we to make of what Isabel says? For a start, what does it refer to? Is it Cordelia's job? Well, we assume so, but neither Cordelia nor we can absolutely know, as the previous words to which it refers are indistinguishable. What do Sophie and Hugo think? We never get explicit answers, only the sound of leaving. Their silence might indicate uncomfortable disagreement or tacit assent. We don't find out. But Cordelia is less concerned with that than the dishonesty of her position as an eavesdropper, waiting at the half-open door, a dishonesty she justifies by referring back to the words of her substitute father. Not her mother this time. How good is this advice from Bernie about the necessity to accept a divorce case, the kind that Philip Marlowe wouldn't accept? It's not chivalrous, is it? Well, Bernie was hardly a knight in shining armour, was he? But Cordelia still follows his advice in her head. Hugo and Sophia might place Cordelia in the tradition of the detective who can't be bought. I'm not entirely so sure that Cordelia does. By the time the phrase occurs for the third and last time, Cordelia is ready to mobilize it herself, to say it before it's said to her, and so gain power over it, perhaps. The occasion is the party in Isabel's smart Panton Street house, and Cordelia is in conversation with Mark's tutor, the young dandy Edward Horsfall, who was, I quote, not much over 30, very tall, his hair falling long over one eye, his lean body curved as a melon rind, a comparison reinforced by the pleated yellow shirt front under a jutting bow tie. He's completely enfolded in the little world of Cambridge, using code that Cordelia doesn't understand. While for outsiders, where you're from might mean where you were born, in Cambridge it asks what college you're affiliated to. And of course there's a pecking order of colleges. So this information is a clue for Edward of status within the university. Edward, in fact, is so confident of his status that he's entirely unfazed by Cordelia's comment that she's a private detective. With his anecdote here, he classifies her as amongst the useless servant classes. And note again how the anecdote concerns private detectives as sexual snoopers. Cordelia tries to take charge of the verbal space by interrupting him with what we have by now come to regard, through the operation of the hermeneutic cycle, as a commonplace that detection is an unsuitable job for a woman. But again, he's so confident, so intellectually agile, that he's no problem at all in remaining in charge of the verbal field. For him, detective work is so low in status that it's a job that is entirely suitable for women, since it requires what he regards as low status feminine characteristics, basically effortful nosiness, not, we assume, the kind of casual brilliance he enjoys, which displays no sign of the labour that went into it, that just gets tossed off. He's bored by Cordelia. She's outside his restricted world, and he wanders off to find insiders like himself. For all her closeness to middle-class behaviours and culture, her lack of status, her lack of symbolic capital derived from belonging to a Cambridge college, that is, her lack of symbolic capital derived from social capital, the network of powerful friends implied by belonging to a college, means that she isn't worth talking to. And this is, for many critics, actually the position that Cordelia ends with. Somehow, she's not worth talking to or about. She's just too conservative and dull. Cordelia's low status as a detective amongst the critics, as indeed amongst the characters, seems signalled most powerfully by the appearance of Adam Dalgliesh at the end of the novel, after his name's already appeared 8 times. Why does this powerful patriarchal figure have to appear? Certainly, according to the critics, it's to show that P.D. James wants us to know that men are ultimately in charge. As I've said, previously Dalgliesh has 14 novels in which he's the central character, while Cordelia has only 2. And here he is, appearing in hers. What do we think of that? It's time now to start on the last of the preparatory moves before answering the question I promised you. An answer to what Pryde took his revenge means. It's time to start thinking about the concept and practice of homosociality and a woman as gift. I want to tell you a story of a formula, of a kind you've seen before in the Henry Dunbar stories. Let's imagine 2 men, B and D, and a woman who we'll call C. It's a very traditional kind of marriage plot. It's in fact a family story. It's a love story, of course. C lives with her father B, and D falls in love with her, so he says. C and D marry. She replaces her father's surname with D's, and she goes to live with D. Father B gives C away, as the saying goes. The love story here is an alliance of 2 families. Horrors, though. Love is sexual, yes, but it's also D's love for that family alliance. Is D interested in an alliance with C? Well, no, she's not worth allying herself with. She's merely a gift from one man to another. She is merely an object of exchange. The real love story is between the 2 men. She doesn't really exist. Of course, we're not talking of a simply genital love between 2 men, but a love of power. The woman, the sexual object, is merely the messenger, the sign, a gift passed between them. The woman C is not a subject in her own right. That's why she's disappeared here. As the phrase goes, however much she may think she is. She's an empty vessel. She carries the seeds. She carries the seams, the messages from one man to another. If she thinks anything else, if she thinks she's a subject in her own right, that's all fantasy. Of course, you'll have guessed that this formula story, this commonplace narrative, this formulaic trope refers to Bernie, Cordelia, and Dalgliesh. Bernie, as you remember, had once served in the CID under Dalgliesh, who had later fired him. Even so, Bernie continued to regard Dalgliesh as the ultimate arbiter, the most powerful authority in how detection should be done. I think it's pretty clear that Bernie was obsessed with Adam Dalgliesh, that he'd put him on a pedestal, even though Dalgliesh had him fired. Cordelia, the dutiful Cordelia trained in a convent, the dutiful Cordelia who goes to help her father when he calls her. She adopts a similar attitude towards Bernie as Bernie does towards Dalgliesh, and therefore indirectly she has the same attitude towards Dalgliesh. She doesn't really exist. She reminds herself and us of the precepts constantly that Bernie told her he'd learnt from Dalgliesh. Bernie is setting Cordelia up to be a carrier of his mirroring love for Dalgliesh back to Dalgliesh. In this version of An Unsuitable Job for a Woman, we aren't talking in a simple way of love between men. Cordelia is not carrying a message of love, but is rather the vessel of Pryde's revenge on Adam Dalgliesh for having thrown him out of the CID. Bernie is sending a message to Adam Dalgliesh of frustrated love, not a simple direct demand for alliance. It's more like, I loved you and now look what you made me do, rather than, let's go to the football match or play golf together and see how we can make our alliance make us more powerful. Meanwhile, here's this woman. The woman, nonetheless, is the messenger. Now, this isn't a new idea. In literary studies, the most influential proponent of the homosocial narrative, which is what I've been describing here, the most influential proponent of this idea is Eve Sedgwick, whose Between Men came out in 1985. Sedgwick showed us how the pattern of homosocial desire between men, signalled by the parting of a woman between them, is a recurrent pattern in English literature, not just in detective fiction. In fact, she doesn't even discuss detective fiction. But the idea wasn't new in 1985, as Sedgwick herself well knew. In wider gender studies, probably the most famous proponent of the idea was Gail Rubin's wonderfully polemic chapter, The Traffic in Women, Notes on the Political Economy of Sex, a piece that came out just 3 years after An Unsuitable Job for a Woman. And if you're interested in gender, if you've any claim to being interested in gender, you really should read this fantastic and still relevant article, as it's the very article, for goodness sake, that defines the sex-gender system within which we still, though rather more tenuously now, operate. It may be a polemical piece, but it's really not difficult to read. I strongly urge you to go away and read it directly. Don't listen to people talking about it. Go away and read it yourselves. So you can see that the very distinction between sex and gender enters public consciousness around the time of An Unsuitable Job for a Woman. The two are part of the same cultural continuum. And yes, you'll object rightly that the Gail Rubin appeared 3 years after An Unsuitable Job for a Woman. How could the novel have been referring to that chapter, however famous or infamous at the time? Well, for a start, Sedgwick, like Rubin, was concerned to show what had been going on for centuries. She's concerned with bringing to light structures of homosocial practices which prevented women from operating as subjects in their own right for hundreds of years. Rubin's and Sedgwick's analyses were both retrospective, and because of that, they could frankly easily have incorporated An Unsuitable Job for a Woman into their own narratives, into their own arguments. But actually, the idea of homosocial alliance between men through the gifts of women between them was itself, as Rubin herself acknowledges, an even older one. She'd taken it from, amongst other sources, the wonderful consideration of gifts in pre-technological societies by the French anthropologist Marcel Mauss, whose Essai sur le temps had appeared in the 1920s. What Rubin did was politicize the notion, which Mauss had not done. And what Sedgwick did was to apply that notion to the study of English literature. Underlying the feminist critics' discussion of An Unsuitable Job for a Woman is this notion. Feminist critics don't like this novel because it obeys, for them, the homosocial narrative. Cordelia's claims that what she does is a valid form of work are based on a fantasy that the text openly asserts is nothing but a fantasy. And as we saw in the first video on this novel, what Cordelia does in solving the crime is just to create more crime. Adam Dalgliesh has to come in at the end to contain the mess and muddle that she's created in the world. For despite her love of order that she's learnt in the convent, well, she's just a woman and nothing, not a subject in her own right. Dalgliesh comes in as both a representative of the law and, more crucially, as a representative of the order, which is justice. Legally, he should put Cordelia on trial so that she gets sent to prison for perverting the course of justice, as the legal phrase is. In terms of abstract justice beyond the law, though, all the most active criminals, both the murderers, are dead. In terms of justice itself, there's balance. Order is restored, and Adam Dalgliesh understands that like a deus ex machina, like a god that comes in at the end to restore order in Greek tragedy. Well, of a sort. So now, by mobilizing feminist homosocial discourse, I've effectively reduced Cordelia to a bumbling nonentity. I've come to agree with the critic, I've come to agree with the author herself, the conservative Anglican P.D. James. But, and remember there's always a but with me, we have to ask, in whose interest is this discourse working? Who benefits from describing the reality of the novel in this way? To whose advantage? We always have to ask that ancient Latin question, that ancient Latin forensic question. Cui bono? To whose advantage is this statement made? I rebel. I refuse to read Cordelia as a nothing, as ineffective. Cordelia may be flawed, but I like her. I want her to survive. I want her to thrive. I want, as you remember in the music, the C to continue beyond and independently of the B and the D that surround her. I have a very powerful affective response to her. I refuse to see her as written out of the story as simply an empty vessel carrying a message of love between two men. I'm not suggesting at all that this narrative doesn't structure the novel. Of course, it's there, it's open to us, but it's not the only possible reading. It's not, we can read this as a female Bildungsroman where Cordelia survives. Why should I allow the discourse of homosociality close off the novel to my pleasure and to my disturbance? For it's not actually the homosocial narrative that disturbs me as a male reader. Why should it? That narrative reasserts my power after all. It could and should be a source of pleasure to me. But no, I want Cordelia to exist as a subject in her own right. If there's one thing I want you to take away from this video, it's attention to how you feel and the need also to read suspiciously. We need to look for clues like detectives for alternative meanings. We need to follow our guts, and isn't, after all, what Cordelia herself did. We need to read like a doctor for the symptoms of social rather than physical illness. What are the crimes here? And to do that, we need to read the text very carefully, word by word, sentence by sentence, noting the formal operations of the hermeneutic cycle. And we mustn't assume that the first thing that comes to mind either is the right one. We need to place the text in its context. We need to be alert to how the text's readers, close to the time of its publication, might have read it. What pleasures of proximity they might have gained. And so let's do that to end this video.
Who exactly makes the claim that Pryde took his revenge? Yes, the critics. But in the text? Well, it's the great Adam Dalgliesh. He's the one who interprets the whole novel for us in these terms, and the critics, thinking that they're following P.D. James's intentions, which they might very well be, believe him. But can't we read him suspiciously as an example of the narcissistic patriarchal, like Edward Horsfall? Of course the story has to be all about him. Of course it has to be about homosocial relations between men, because that places him at the center of discourse. It reassures him that he and men like him are still in control of reality. Can we read this novel perhaps not as a deliberate denunciation of patriarchy intended by the author, that it almost certainly is not, but rather as an accidental revelation of social injustice, the treatment of women by an elaborate patriarchal system, a Bildungsroman not of how middle-class masculine identities formed and integrated into society, but a Bildungsroman that reveals how, despite everything that patriarchy puts against her and the failure of family relations on a huge scale, a woman's professional identity is formed and does survive, not comfortably integrated, but alertly on the margins. I'm rooting for Cordelia when I read this novel. I want detection to be a suitable job for a woman, as I want it for everyone. I rebel at the idea that it might not be. And that rebellion, that resistive reading, is an alternative way of reading the novel. That the form of the novel, with that curious section starring Adam Dalgliesh, fails to close down. So many of us feel that the section with Adam Dalgliesh is just bizarre. Students like me think it's a postscript, a failed recantation. No, I refuse to lock this novel down with Pryde took his revenge. Perhaps instead we can read its failure for us as patriarchy failing to contain Cordelia and reduce her developing subjectivity to objecthood. Just as we saw how form failed to exclude alternative readings of the Red Silk Scarf. Perhaps instead of an endorsement of conservative Anglicanism, we can read An Unsuitable Job for a Woman not as a failure that fails, that's a bad novel, but as a failure that offers an opening to the social transformation and a new future that Adam Dalgliesh and perhaps P.D. James, who knows, would prefer not to imagine. The last words of the novel, "Won't you come in?" are a welcome to a new case. They're also a question whose answer we never find out. A question that's precisely because we don't know its answer opens us to a new and perhaps alternative future that we can imagine, even where the author, and at least some of her characters, might not.